The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I would like to thank Governor Herbert, Governor Martinez, and Governor Otter for the time they're taking today to share important testimony with the committee and the Speaker's Task Force on Intergovernmental Affairs. The committee and task force have been engaged in a review of federalism, identifying opportunities to improve the partnership between the federal government and state and local counterparts. Your testimony will serve an important piece of this narrative as we look toward reform. It's my understanding Governor Herbert must leave by noon, so I will keep my statement short to maximize time for questions, and I will encourage our members to be sensitive to the time, and if there's a question toward the end of the 5 minutes that would require a longer answer, I would encourage the witnesses to provide the answer in writing. To the extent members do not need to use their full 5 minutes, please be mindful of the Governor's time. We will work our way through questions quickly to accommodate everyone's schedule. We would like to welcome those members of the task force joining us today. I ask unanimous consent to waive members of the Speaker's Task Force on Intergovernmental Affairs for today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I will also ask unanimous consent to insert statements from the National Governors Association and Western Governors Association into the record. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the ranking member, my friend Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
I thank the Chair, and I thank my friend Mr. Bishop, in particular with the Intergovernmental Task Force we both serve on. And I want to welcome our distinguished guests, the three governors, for joining us this morning. We're conducting this hearing in collaboration with the Speaker's Task Force on Intergovernmental Affairs. As a member of that task force, I've been glad to work with Mr. Bishop and our colleagues over the course of the past year on several meetings and events centered around the topic of improving coordination among all of the levels of government. One thing our task force has done well is to promote an intergovernmental dialogue that incorporates all perspectives. While I would have preferred to include in today's panel a local government perspective as well as the state perspective with equal billing, I hope we can invite in the near future American mayors and local government officials to testify to the full committee on this topic, and I was gratified that Chairman Gowdy agrees with that request. This is a dialogue best had without segregating the different levels of government in a way that promotes the very divisions we seek to address. In the spirit of promoting intergovernmental collaboration, I intend to introduce the Restore the Partnership Act to establish the National Committee on Intergovernmental Relations, a successor to the Advisory Commission on Intergovernment Relations that operated from 1959 through 1995. The Commission will promote mechanisms for fostering better relations among the levels of government, provide technical assistance to the federal executive and legislative branches in the review of proposed legislation, recommend the most desirable allocation of government functions, responsibilities, and revenues among the various levels of government, and help coordinate and simplify tax laws and administrative policies to achieve more orderly and less competitive fiscal relationship among the levels of government. As a former local government official who served for 14 years in the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, including 5 years as chairman of the county, I've witnessed the good, the bad, and the ugly of intergovernmental relations. In our community, we led efforts to improve regional air quality, enabled by strengthened federal clean air regulations. We also dealt with the burden of unfunded mandates on localities like those imposed at the federal level by the No Child Left Behind Act. And in Virginia, we adhere, unfortunately, to the Dillon Rule, which means local governments in my state only have those powers expressly granted to them. The Dillon Rule severely constrains the ways in which local governments can raise revenue to pay for public safety, public education, and mandates placed in localities by both the federal and state governments. And I think that's really important. Not all of the problems emanate from Washington. Many of them, from the local government perspective, emanate from state capitals. The revenue burden is why those of us from Dillon Rule states are particularly offended by the Trump budget and the administration's so-called infrastructure plan. Undergirding both is an assumption that the federal government defunds an activity or shifts the funding burden down to state and local governments, and that there are untapped and unlimited revenue reserves that will fill the vacuum left by the federal government. The infrastructure plan, for example, would be paid for by taking money from federal transit investments, and the plan would flip the federal highway funding match on its head by requiring local governments to come up with an 80% of project cost as opposed to the current 20%. A Penn-Wharton budget model team found that the plan would likely lead to an additional, at best, $30 billion in state, local, and private spending, 98% less than the $1.3 trillion the administration has claimed would be raised by the plan. The President's budget would compound the infrastructure investment crisis by retreating in federal funding for things like Metro and the types of infrastructure loans, TIFIA loans, that have helped fund transit throughout the United States. The budget also sweeps the rug out from under local affordable housing initiatives by eliminating entirely the Community Development and Community Services block grants, as well as the Home Investment Partnership Program. These housing cuts alone would cost my communities in Fairfax and Prince William counties, right across the river, nearly $10 million, local government, in affordable housing investments. The proposed cuts would expose the conservative panacea of block granting as potentially a more expedient method of cutting federal investments in local communities. I look forward to our discussion today and hope it's not bound by rigid ideology. We should be mindful that not all unfunded mandates consist of the feds putting mandates on states. All 50 states guarantee their citizens the right to a public education, but it's often local governments that bear the majority of the financial burden for public education. In my community, for example, 80% of the cost of public education is borne by my local taxpayers, not by the state. Additionally, not all regulations or mandates are bad. There are federal regulations that ensure everyone's right to a quality education. This federal intervention was necessitated by state and local level intransigence in the past. This equality was hard fought for, and we should never again open the door to the abuse and discrimination that preceded it. Finally, we cannot ignore that a lack of regulation can be a form of an unfunded mandate in itself. For example, pollution from a state that lacks strong environmental protections can and will drift into neighboring states, creating air quality issues and health problems that impose costs on both private and public sectors. Through the work of this committee and the task force, I hope we can create bipartisan support for unfunded mandate reform and find broad agreement that the federal government can and should improve its coordination and collaboration with state, local governments, and tribal governments. I hope the discussion today furthers our work towards those ends. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling us together for this hearing.
I thank the gentleman. I am now pleased to introduce our witnesses, the Honorable Gary Richard Herbert, Governor of the State of Utah, the Honorable Susanna Martinez, Governor of the State of New Mexico, and the Honorable Clement Leroy Otter, Governor of the State of Idaho, and a former member of Congress, and the old 70s TV show, Welcome Back, Cotter, Welcome Back, Otter. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? The record will reflect all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you will show you your remaining time. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. Please also remember to press the button to turn your microphone on before speaking. Our first witness to give testimony will be Governor Herbert, Utah.
Well, thank you, and Chairman Gowdy, Chairman Palmer, Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the committee and the Speaker's Task Force. I thank you for inviting me here today. I've been speaking about this issue for many years and about the importance of federalism, what some describe as the vertical separation of powers between the state and the federal government. And to me, this hearing is a sign of progress. Often when we talk about federalism, we focus on its constitutional foundation. That's important, but there's a very practical reason for federalism: to create better policy. As states, we've tried a wide variety of approaches to solving specific problems and developed expertise across the spectrum of public policy. When our political culture mistakenly presumes that the greatest expertise resides in federal agencies, Americans miss out on the lessons already learned by the states. Today, I'd like to suggest several federal laws that need to change to respect this separation of the power and responsibility and facilitate better policymaking. First, I'd like to point out that laws and rules are poor substitutes for cultural norms, and what we really need is a cultural change within the federal government. Congress and federal agencies must stop viewing states merely as state input as merely a box-checking exercise rather than a genuine attempt to learn from what we're doing. Some infractions of federalism are process problems. The U.S. Code is littered with suggestions that federal agencies consult with states as simply one among many stakeholders. For example, the Water Resources Development Act suggests that the Secretary may consult with key stakeholders, including state, county, and city governments. Similar language is found in the National Historic Preservation Act, the Energy Policy Act, and many, many more. And even as the title of today's hearing implies, that states are not stakeholders, we're sovereign governments, partners who have been involved and should be involved at the beginning of and throughout the policymaking process. The boilerplate language of these laws should be amended to reflect that reality. In the same vein, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, requires a federal agency to work with states to develop various alternatives in an environmental impact statement, but also allows the agency to ultimately ignore input from the states. Sometimes the NEPA process feels like little more than an exercise in generating high-quality paperwork. The law should be amended to give states not just a voice, but a vote in the selection of a NEPA alternative, a change that would make federal land management in the West far more democratic and responsive to the voters. States should also have a more substantive role in execution. The Endangered Species Act authorizes the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to write management plans, designate critical habitat, and impose land use restrictions. This doesn't make necessarily sense to me. Utah's Division of Wildlife Resources is staffed with some of the best biologists in the field who have a profound knowledge of Utah's ecology and wildlife. There is no good reason states shouldn't take the lead in species recovery. I don't want to leave you with a completely negative picture. We are currently enjoying a season of good relationships with many federal agencies, many of whom are trying to push decision-making back down to the states, and that is refreshing. Though it does illustrate what I said earlier about the importance of a culture of cooperation with the states. Good cooperation should not depend on a particular official or administration. It should be simply the way things are always done, regardless of who is currently in power. Again, I think we are making progress. Yesterday, several of my colleagues and I met with Speaker Ryan and later with Minority Leader Pelosi. Representative Pelosi reminded all of us of the famous quote of Judge Brandeis, who said, "States are the laboratories of democracy." And she said, let's let states help lead in developing good policy. I couldn't agree more. I also added another famous quote that most of you know about our father of our Constitution, James Madison, who in talking about and trying to ratify the Constitution and alleviate the fears that the states had about this new, stronger federal government, said to the states not to worry. Federalist 45. It's an interesting read, and it's a short one, so it won't take a long time. But he said, don't worry about the federal government because the powers we've given to the federal government are few and defined. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. He went on to say the powers we've given to the states, though, are numerous and indefinite. We need to get back to the vision of our founding fathers. We do need to change the culture and the thought process. We, the American people, are asking you, the federal government, to do more than your responsibilities would entail, more than what our founding fathers expected you to do. Rather, they should be, in fact, if they have problems and issues, they should first ask the states and their local governments and see if they could find a solution to the problem. We should get back to asking the states. As I said in my initiative as chair of the National Governors Association 3 years ago, the states, which are closer to the people, much more responsive to people, quicker to act, and doing it less expensively and more effectively, are where, in fact, we should be working. States are finding solutions, and improving people's lives. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
I thank Governor Herbert, Governor Martinez. We look forward to your testimony.
Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Connolly, Task Force Chairman Bishop, and members of the committee and of the task force. I am very grateful for this opportunity to speak with you today about the balance of power between the states and our federal government. As federal legislators, you all face an incredible challenge in finding solutions that work for a nation of 320 million people in urban, rural, and frontier areas, spread over 3.8 million square miles. In fact, our nation's incredible geographic and human diversity makes finding a cookie-cutter solution next to impossible. What works in South Carolina may not work in Virginia, and what works in New Mexico may not even work for our neighbors in Utah, which is precisely why it is imperative the federal government recognize the sovereignty of states, work with us, and allow us to lead and to innovate. When you do, great things really do happen. The New Mexico Human Services Department implemented our state's Medicaid managed care program, Centennial Care, in 2014, under a demonstration waiver granted by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Through this innovative program, managed care organizations administer a full array of services to New Mexicans through an integrated model. Care coordinators across the state help to ensure members receive the right services at the right time. New Mexico is a leader in providing home and community-based services, and we're actually addressing per-person health care costs. This innovation and resulting success is possible because the federal government allowed New Mexico to design and implement a Medicaid program that works for our state and for our people. House Resolution 1333, sponsored by Congressman Earl Buddy Carter of Georgia, would provide us with even more freedom to further improve program efficiencies. When we do not receive that flexibility, inefficient federal processes tend to have dire consequences that reverberate across my state. And as another example, it takes our Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department just 10 days to review new oil and gas permits. But it takes the Bureau of Land Management in New Mexico an average of 250 days. This delay has led to a BLM backlog of more than 800 applications for permits to drill in New Mexico at a cost of approximately $1.9 million to New Mexico and $3.4 million to the federal government per day. Annually, this amounts to $710 million for New Mexico and $1.2 billion for the federal government in lost and delayed revenue. If the BLM were to delegate its oil and gas revenue process to New Mexico and to other western states, for these resources on federal lands, states like Montana and Utah, it would result in billions of dollars of additional state and federal revenue. During my time as New Mexico's governor, I've seen two different sides of the state-federal partnerships. At times, regulations and edicts from Washington have brought rigid and formulaic programs to New Mexico that do not allow us to adapt them to our unique states. That tide seems to be turning, as federal agencies like the Department of Interior and the Department of Transportation are engaging with us to face common challenges. As elected officials, we all strive to deliver the best possible results for those that we represent as well. We do that best when we work together and constructively and collaboratively as true partners. And I thank you for this opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you. Governor Otter, if you would give your testimony.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate very much the opportunity to be here. Chairman Rob, good to see you again. Chairman Bishop, good to see you again, and Ranking Member Conley. It is indeed, members, it is indeed a pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to appear before you and talk about the relationships between the federal government and the federal government's creators, the states. I come to you in my 12th year as governor of the great state of Idaho. I have approximately 113 days, 13 hours, 27 minutes until I leave office, but then who's counting? During my tenure, there's been 3 presidential administrations. At times, they have provided me the opportunity to see federalism at its finest. Idaho has been treated as a true partner with a meaningful voice in national policies and that most directly impact all our citizens. At other times, and far too often, I have experienced the kind of dysfunction and heavy-handedness from our national government that make a mockery of what the founders referred to as federalism. In fact, I've seen both interpretations of federalism come into play on a single issue, not only during my 6 years here in Congress, but also as my 3 terms as governor. The limited and narrow powers granted to the federal government by our Constitution have been expanded exponentially, constantly reaching far beyond those originally enumerated and essential powers relegated through the 10th Amendment to the dustbin of history. The kind of mission creep is most apparent in Idaho and throughout the West, wherever the federal government controls access to the enormous and vast swaths of our lands. Instead of being recognized as sovereign states with equal standing in our union and essential interest at stake, when it comes to managing our resources, we find ourselves continually having to ask the federal government, "Mother, may I?" And the problem increasingly extends beyond land management to issues as diverse as immigration and health care. Nevertheless, hope abounds. I want to express my appreciation to Congress and the current administration for working to restore the standing of states as true partners in governance. After years as afterthought, how we collaborate and develop our own solutions once again matters again. In Idaho, this rebirth of federalism is resulting in development and application of innovative approaches to addressing shared challenges. With the encouragement of President Trump and the Congress, and consistent with our role as the states as laboratories of democracy, I signed an executive order in January of this year directing my Department of Insurance to seek creative ways of improving access to affordable health care coverage in Idaho. We have seen premiums for the Affordable Health Care Act skyrocket in Idaho over the past 3 years. As a result, individuals and families are forced to make unacceptable choice of paying for health care or paying for groceries. But encouragement by an elimination of the individual mandate and this administration's expressed support for greater flexibility, Idaho will now have the opportunity for an off-exchange state plan that provides essential coverage at more affordable rates. Despite some overwrought arguments to the contrary, our plan actually will complement the ACA. That's because Idaho is requiring that insurance carriers that offer choice in the state-based plans must also provide ACA-qualified plans. And most importantly, all ACA and state-based plans will be within the single risk pool, thereby broadening the risk and providing for the individual marketplace. Instead of standing idly by as more and more hardworking Idahoans are priced out or left out of the ACA insurance coverage, we decided to tackle the problem head-on using a first-of-its-kind approach, and we are confident that it will work. Another good example of our improving relationship with the federal government relates to a program known as the Good Neighbor Authority. In 2014, during the last administration, the 2014 Farm Bill authorizes states to lead forest restoration projects on national forest lands. That collaborative, cross-jurisdictional effort is increasing the pace and scale of timber harvest projects in areas prone to insect damage, disease damage, and subsequent wildfire. Over the next 3 years, we expect to treat nearly 11,000 acres of federal Forest Service land using the Good Neighbor Authority, harvesting 70 million board feet of timber and bringing $14.5 million in revenue. Good Neighbor Authority improves the forest health, reduces fire risk, boosts the rural economy, and pays for itself. It truly is the gold standard for cooperative federalism. We are similarly encouraged by the Trump administration's commitment to streamlining efficient and costly environmental review process. Decisions too often are being made in anticipation of being sued rather than based on sound science and local conditions. And finally, we are continue to benefit from the flexibility that's being offered in Every Student Succeeds Act. Idaho is now empowered to be the architects of our own K through career education in Idaho. While this recent renewal of classic federalism is welcome and refreshing, there still remains much work, and I appreciate this committee's attention to that work. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. And thank you also for your continuing service to the United States of America. And Mr. Chairman, I stand ready to answer questions.
Thank the witnesses for their testimony. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah, the chairman of the Committee on Natural Resources and chairman of the Speaker's Task Force on Intergovernmental Affairs, Mr. Bishop.
Hey, thank you, Gary, and thank you to the three governors for joining us here today. It's extremely good to have you back here. And I'm grateful to be here, especially for the task force. I noticed, I think, about 6 members of the task force have been or were here or are leaving here at the same time, whatever. Let me tell you what I'm going to ask each of you so you can be thinking about it and then preface this for just a second. So, Governor Herbert, I want to hit you up on the consultation concept again, go into more detail on that. Ms. Martinez, I do want to talk to you about how we can make this effort on federalism bipartisan approach. And for Governor Otter, I want to talk to you again about what you called mission creep or creeping conditionalism. You have to realize, I mean, there are about 266 former legislators who are members of Congress. I don't know why we forget our lessons we learned in the state legislature, but it seems that when we come here to Congress, all of a sudden, we want to solve all sorts of problems regardless of how those problems are solved. There is something that is very unique now as both parties, both liberals and conservatives, are now talking about federalism under different titles more than ever before. If I notice, you know, Senator Feinstein has a bill that deals with federalism dealing with drones, and Representative Cohen has one that deals with drug policy, and Senator Baldwin has one that deals with health partnership, and one of you mentioned a resolution by Representative Carter. People are now talking about that. This is an opportunity we have of actually trying to implement it. So, Governor Herbert, let me start with you. You talked about collaboration, how important it is. We have long talked about consultation is important. How do we actually define consultation here to allow that state and local governments are ensured that they are consulted and that their comments are taken seriously? For example, we've had court cases in the state of Utah where commissioners, decisions have been thrown out because they said the commissioners had too much influence vis-a-vis NGOs. How do we ensure that states actually do fulfill that consultation role?
I think part of it is that what I talked about, a culture of change. We need to go back and review the role of the federal government in conjunction with the role of the states. It is often forgot that the federal government was, as Butch Otter has said, created by the states. And we are sovereign states. We are, as Justice Bryant said, you know, laboratories of democracy. We do have a role to play. And that's part of an attitude thing. For whatever reason, we've got to the point where we seem to ignore the role of the states and aren't listening to what the states are doing and let them perform their role as laboratories of democracy.
You went through a litany of laws in which it's allowed. Would it be better if we actually wrote laws so it was mandated?
I think that, one, there ought to be a mandate to listen and respect the role of the states. And again, it's not a matter of just checking off a box and saying, well, we've got your input, now we'll ignore it.
Okay.
We think the state should have a role to make decisions, and we ought to devolve the decision-making power back to the states. We'd get a better result and less cost to the taxpayer.
Governor Martinez, how can we make this concept of federalism bipartisan? I mean, you represent a purple state, whereas in Utah and Idaho, I think we've got zoning ordinances that keep Democrats at bay.
If only you had a little purple.
Very well. I'm not going to say anything about Californians. So, how do we make this issue bipartisan?
Thank you for that question. So sorry, I forgot the button. Thank you very much for that question, Congressman Bishop. I think it's important that we remember that we're not politicians, but we're actually leaders. I am a Republican governor in a state where we're outnumbered 3-1 by Democrats and independents. And so therefore, I have a very clear understanding that I represent all the people of New Mexico and not just those who voted for me or those of the same party. We have done this many times through, for example, when I expanded Medicaid. When I expanded Medicaid, it was not necessarily something that was a Republican thing to do. However, I went on a listening tour, private and local communities, private businesses. I did it with organizations and advocacy groups, and wanted to hear why I should or should not expand Medicaid. And at the end of the day, I did what was right for the people of New Mexico. I actually did expand Medicaid, and I have also, through that process, costs per month, per person and per month have actually gone down, and that's why we're a leader in New Mexico, because this was not a political decision.
I appreciate you doing that because you're talking about the attitude that Governor Herbert was talking about. And in the 5 seconds I've got left, I appreciate where you're talking because we're going to have an energy bill that tries to partner with the states to allow the states to do all the paperwork, keep the federal standards, but the states do the paperwork to see if we can actually work together more. I hope that comes in there. Butch, I'm out of time, but if there's a second round, I want to come back to this idea of mission creep and creeping conditionalism with you. I'll yield back, but sorry.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Governor Martinez, I appreciate the decision you made on the expansion of Medicaid. I believe Governor Kasich, your Republican colleague in Ohio, made a similar decision. And we're now wrestling with it yet again in Virginia. It's costing my state billions of dollars not to do it. It's 400,000 people not getting coverage that otherwise would get it. And ironically, it's the red parts of the state, it's rural areas that are seeing the pressure on their hospitals and clinics closing because they financially can't make it. And the expansion of Medicaid would save those hospitals and provide care to people who desperately need it. So I applaud your non-political decision. And I think that is the spirit in which Republicans and Democrats ought to approach governance, especially at the state and local level. All three of you come from Western states, and I know that if we had the governor of New York and the governor of Virginia and some other governors, we might have a different perspective about the Trump administration and how helpful it's been or not. And I guess the jury will be out, we'll see. But the philosophy you all are sharing with us, I find myself largely in agreement in principle. And Governor Herbert, I was shaking my head listening to you thinking, you know, a lot of wisdom there. But doesn't that apply to local governments too? Are any of you Dillon rural states?
I come from local government.
You come from local
I was
government.
a local county commissioner, and I have concerns about making sure that the state and the legislature and the governor respect the role of the counties and the cities. So certainly there's some tension there.
Yeah.
The difference is, though, the states created those local entities. So they are the mother. They're the ones that created it. The federal government is created by the states, that miracle in 1787. So it's a matter of roles and responsibilities under the law. You're right, this should not be a partisan issue. It's the vision of our founding fathers embedded in our Constitution.
Yeah, certainly there is a legal argument that local governments are the creatures of the state. They are created by the state. But practically speaking, that doesn't really get us very far. In my state, the local government I headed is the biggest in the state and one of the biggest in the United States. We were full service. You know, my budget's bigger than our budget was bigger than 7 states' budgets. And what we constantly were subjected to, and this is not unique to my state. You see it. You see this tension in lots of states, but you know, the state legislature was prejudiced against the more affluent northern part of the state, which, by the way, funds about half of the state. And so when you look at formulas for allocating resources, we always got the short end of the stick. In fact, one egregious example, there was a library fund years ago created, of course mostly funded by Northern Virginia, by my taxpayers, and they actually had a formula that said no jurisdiction larger than 900,000 could qualify for benefits from the fund. So we funded the fund, and we got zero benefits because, of course, we were the only jurisdiction with more than 900,000 people in the state of Virginia, just so happened. It got that egregious. And, you know, we get real nervous when people talk about block granting things because that goes to the state capital where we know we're going to get the short end of the stick. We won't get a fair share. And so I'm just curious, since none of you actually address local government in your opening remarks, understandably you're talking about your relationship with the feds, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander. What about your local governments? Have you ever taken a careful look at the state level about the unfunded mandates you impose, not you personally, but the state does, and sort of the imposition sometimes you make in laws and regulations that they then have to implement? Because the ultimate implementer of everything is local government. Governor Otter, you're shaking your head.
Yes, well, thank you, Representative Conley. I can tell you this, that in my 12 years as governor and all the legislation, probably 350 pieces of legislation that I sign, are responsible for either signing or not signing or vetoing every year. In the most cases, the limitations that are put on local units of government are actually edicts from the federal government. And you can go right through almost every agency, starting with the EPA and the Clean Water Act and those sort of things. So if a local government wants to develop in a certain area, they must certainly follow through all the...
If I can interrupt, Governor Otter, because of time, forgive me. But I mean, that's not true in the case of education funding formulas. That's a state formula, not a federal formula. And it has a huge impact on local governments and the tax rates they have to charge or not charge to fund their local education. In my case, 80% of our school funding we bear because the state has a funding formula that just so happens to discriminate against certain parts of the state and benefits other certain parts of the state. I'm sure politics has nothing to do with it. That's not a federal issue. That's a state issue.
Perhaps we're a little more fair in Idaho because we actually assign so much money for each and every classroom unit, no matter whether it's in Wieppe, Idaho, or Boise, Idaho, the largest school district or the smallest.
My time is up. I want to learn more about that. Maybe we could get you to Richmond and educate them a little bit about funding formulas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank each of you for your testimony here today. The first one, the committee has reviewed a number of major federal regulatory actions where the federal government actually did not adequately consult with the states. Some of those were with the EPA, Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Labor in its overtime rule, Department of Interior in terms of stream buffers, are just a few examples of those. So the Executive Order 13-132 on federalism and unfunded mandates actually required consultation with state and local governments. Can each of you very quickly let me know how do you think that this particular executive order is working? Is the consultation actually taking place? And so, Governor, will you go ahead and Herbert, if you'll go ahead and start.
Thank you. The fact that we're here today talking about it, we see progress. I'm hopeful. The fact that former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, first thing out of her mouth yesterday, meeting with a few of us governors, was, hey, Judge Bryant, it's laboratories of democracy. We need to let you guys take the lead on these policy issues. I think we are getting heard. I think there's been an attitudinal change. It needs to continue. And so I feel good about the direction we're headed.
All right, Governor Martinez.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Certainly there's been more collaboration in the last 2 years than I experienced in the previous 6 years as being governor. I have actually been asked to sit at tables within the Department of Transportation, as well as sitting at the table with a variety yesterday with a committee in reference to our prisons and the reforms that can take place for individuals that are moving from within the prisons and out into the communities. That never happened before. I never even received a phone call when things were taking place, in particular when an endangered species was being listed and the state wasn't given the opportunity to protect that species as is supposed to be given in order to eliminate the federal involvement so that we can protect it and continue to have that not on the list of endangered species.
All right, thank you, Governor. Governor Otter.
Congressman, I can think of several times when we have been consulted many times and never listened to. I've served as governor under three different presidents, 3 different administrations. And from time to time, early on in my first 2 years, when the Bush administration, things began to change, and not for the better. They got worse for the next 8 years. Now they're starting to get better again. So simply requiring consultation doesn't always work. Sometimes there has to be a result, and whose side are we going to make the final decision on, the states or the federal government side?
All right, so let me real quickly in the 2 minutes I have remaining follow up on that, because what you're saying is it's not enough to just listen, but it's actually to take that input and actually put it into action. So would you say that what we're seeing is actually more efficient policy and cost savings as a result of that collaboration?
Clearly, as we look back, and just again, one of the controversial issues is the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. The governors were never one time consulted and asked, what's our opinion, yet we're going to be on the front lines of having to implement the program.
So what you're saying is this collaboration could actually save the American taxpayer dollars in real way.
Better policy.
Yeah, okay.
It's certainly, again, we ought to have the states weigh in, and we ought to not just be listened to, but respected and considered, and let us be part of the decision-making process.
All right, Governor Martinez, do you agree with that?
Well, I agree that certainly in the education reform that was discussed by Congressman Connolly is that we were in collaboration with the federal government under the Obama administration. We were in collaboration, we were in agreement on education reforms, but it was our Democrat state legislature that was not in collaboration with the state.
But I can't help with that problem.
I understand. But there are opportunities that we have actually agreed.
All right, Governor Otter.
I would say yes, and improving daily.
All right. So if that is indeed the case, would you encourage more reforms of this type where we can actually streamline this, yes or no? In my 12 seconds, yes. Governor?
Yes, the more you devolve the states, the better it's going to be.
Governor?
Absolutely. There is no cookie-cutter solution that can be done for all states.
Yes.
Governor? All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much for putting together this terrific panel, and it's an honor to be in the presence of these governors. Everybody loves federalism in principle. Everybody loves federalism in theory, in the abstract. The question is whether you're willing to defend federalism when it cuts against your deepest held policy preferences. And so I want to try to get beyond the level of principle, which we all embrace, to the critical issues that are facing us in this Congress. Let's start with marijuana. Right now, this might be the greatest federalism issue in the country. We have dozens of states that have embarked upon experiments with medical marijuana, with decriminalization of marijuana, with treating it as a public health problem rather than a criminal problem. And we've got the Attorney General of the United States, Attorney General Sessions, who wants to come down like a sledgehammer on the states to crush all of these experiments and to revive a war on marijuana. And I just wonder whether any of you are willing to take a position on behalf of states' rights and federalism against what the Attorney General is trying to do. Governor Otter, perhaps you could start and just quickly go down.
Of all the states that I border, 4 of them have legalized recreational marijuana. And it would be one thing if that stopped at the border, but it doesn't stop.
Well, nothing ever stops at the border. That's always the argument that the nationalizers take against people who I thought you were siding with, which was the states' rights people.
But it doesn't cause harm. to my citizens.
That's always the argument made. You see, there's the problem.
Well, maybe that
we all love
argument's
federalism
good.
in theory, but are we really willing to stick to it when it comes to a specific case where we're against it? I assume you don't favor the decriminalization of marijuana.
I do not.
Okay. So, Governor Martinez, where do you stand on it?
As a prosecutor for 25 years and on the border of New Mexico with the Mexican border, I do not support the legalization of marijuana. I completely support—
As a matter of states' right, you mean as a matter of exercise of your state power. The question is, do you think the federal government should crush the experiments in the states with dealing with the marijuana problem?
As law stands today, it is my responsibility as a lawyer, as the governor of the people of New Mexico. I have to comply with the laws of the United States government, and that means there's no legalization of marijuana in my state. However, we do have a medical marijuana program that is very successful.
And they want to crush that too. Governor Herbert.
You've put the states in a catch-22 problem. You have a federal law that says it's illegal. If you don't like that, change the law.
Yeah, so
That allows us, then, as states, to take on the responsibility on a state-right basis. We are learning. We're next door to Colorado. I've worked with Governor Hickenlooper. He's told us as a state and other governors, be very careful, watch what we do.
So you're supporting a change in federal laws to allow the states to experiment?
Change federal law, yeah. You can't, you put.
So let's try another one, which is, again, something we're
Take it
dealing
off
with.
the Schedule 1 so we can actually do the research necessary to back up, get science to back up with at least the anecdotal stories.
Here's another one that's happening right now. There's an effort to wipe out medical malpractice laws across the country and to impose one federal, one-size-fits-all solution in terms of medical malpractice, where the awards are set when you get a jury trial and so on. Do you favor that, or do you think each of the states should be able to decide for themselves what their medical malpractice laws are?
We already have that in Idaho.
You have what?
We have limitations on medical.
Sure, but they're set at different places in different states. Do you think we should have one-size-fits-all national solution, or do you think the states should be able to decide for themselves?
I do not think we ought to have a national solution.
Governor Martinez.
I agree completely.
Yes.
State decision-making, no one-size-fits-all.
Okay. Well, so there, I just want you to know you're siding with the Democrats in Congress against the legislation that's being pushed by the Republicans. And that's why I'm with you. I appreciate the fact that you're standing up for the federalism principle, in reality when it counts. Let me just do one more. The concealed carry permits. There's an attempt to wipe out all of the laws of the states on concealed carry, to say that if you get the right to carry a loaded weapon in Florida, which has very liberal laws on this, you should be able to come into my state, for example, which doesn't allow people who have domestic violence offenses or other violent misdemeanor convictions to get one. Do you think that should be a matter of national law, or do you think it should be up to the states who gets to carry a loaded pistol
I can tell you, clearly, it's been tested all the way to the Supreme Court as a state issue. We have reciprocity. We have people that come to Utah get a concealed weapon permit in 31 other states.
And you can make the reciprocity agreements.
Yeah. Reciprocity, there should not be a national norm.
Gotcha. Governor Martinez.
Absolutely. I have a concealed carry license, and I at first was very leery, but I certainly appreciate the fact that it's something that can be decided within the state, because as a law enforcement family, my father, my husband, my son, it always worried me the citizens were carrying it. However, with the training that we have implemented, it is a very safe thing to be able to have a concealed carry.
And you don't want us trampling the laws of New Mexico to say, we know better than you. We're going to bring you down to the lowest common denominator.
That's exactly right.
Governor Otter.
I believe the same. It's a state issue.
Well, I thank you very much for standing up for federalism in that case, and I'm happy to yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all governors for being here today and for your testimony. As coming from Puerto Rico, we also got the same problem in the states. And when this executive order may not apply to the island, as we do not have that sovereign power, I may say that all those regulations did apply and do apply to Puerto Rico. And each agency, it says the executive order, shall have an accountable process to ensure meaningful and timely input by state and local officials in the development of regulatory policies that have federalism implications within 90 days. Of course, that 90 days never occur, and that designation that comes with that mandate always put a burden in some of the states to comply with those regulations. So what kind of burden in terms of the expenses all of your states are incurring to comply with all those regulations in your states? Governor Otter?
Well, I haven't added up the list of the costs that we've had, but I can tell you this: nearly every public policy that we deal with in Idaho, we have to factor in what the federal government wants us to do, as well as how much of the cost they want us to suffer. So I would tell you, when we establish public policy, we really need to see who it helps and who it harms. And sometimes there's very little attention or care paid, especially from the federal level.
Governor Martinez?
Yes, thank you so much, and certainly our prayers continue to be with your people in Puerto Rico. Regulations, for example, with BLM and the duplication of work that takes place with the federal government and the state government, the types of testing that is done for environmental testing, that is a duplication of costs, not only to state government, but also to the federal government and the people who are conducting business within our state. You know, time is money. And when something can take 10 days within a state regulation, but takes 250 days in a federal regulation, you can see where time is money, and that business people will end up going someplace else to conduct business where it is easier and better to do it because they don't have the federal land that they're having to deal with BLM, but actually having to deal with just state land.
Are we talking about NEPA?
NEPA is one of those that is required, yes, and in sometimes it's not required, but they're making us do it anyways, which ends up being more expensive. There are regulations that actually have exclusions, but we're made to comply nonetheless.
And how much will that cost to your state?
Oh, the cost that I was quoting you just a while ago, it costs the federal government in actual dollars. It is $1.9 million to New Mexico per day and $3.4 million to the federal government per day in revenues. That is what is being lost right now because of these regulations.
Let me just speak about Utah, and again, it kind of goes to what Representative Connolly was talking about, local government. When we put together our budget, we have local government comes to us and said, we'll trade you $1 of federal money that comes to the local government for 85 cents of a state dollar. And that's because the red tape, the regulations are so expensive, they'll give a discount of 15% just to get a state dollar. Why does it take so long for the federal government to make decisions? We had a question with Interior here on a road, whether it should be opened or closed on some of our public lands. It took us 7.5 years to get a decision. And the only reason we got a decision was because we eventually decided to sue to make a decision. That is time is money. And when you have local governments say, we'll give you the federal dollar, give us back just 85 cents, we know that the cost of the federal oversight is really getting too expensive and too time-consuming.
So you know that with President Trump's infrastructure plan, we also are looking for a streaming process in NEPA. Are you in favor of that, of course?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Can you provide some examples of specifically what can we be looking at that process directly for the states?
Well, I can tell you that we find most of the standards for our highway systems in Idaho, if there's any federal participation in those, in some cases, if it's our state highways paid for by our state-only money leading to a federal connection, an intersection, those are required to meet the same standards. And those are standards that may work very well in Virginia or New York or someplace else, but in Idaho, it's a little different.
I agree. Certainly, I think NEPA has its place, but to have it overly expansive on a state that not necessarily, like we're very rural, and to have similar type of testing, I believe in the facts and the evidence and the data that shows that whether or not NEPA is something that should be applied to a particular project. If it doesn't support it, then we shouldn't be doing it just for the sake of that's how we've always done it.
I think it speaks to a lack of trust. Again, the federal government doesn't believe that our own environmental scientists can make the assessment and the evaluation. We're doing a reconstruction of our interstate along the Wasatch Front. It's the same right-of-way and roads that we've had for 50 years. Why are we having to go to, because we're expanding capacity, a complete revival of an environmental assessment costs time, and it's a waste of time and money.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Mrs. Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Much of the discussion, both from those of us in Congress as we question you and from you has assumed an adversarial relationship. Of course, there is a built-in adversarial relationship when you're part of a whole and you yet you are very different. We are exquisitely different from coast to coast. On the other hand, the deep pockets of the federal government does allow it, along with the Constitution and Federalist notions, to fund important benefits that the states want. I want to ask about Medicaid expansion because of the way you all have approached it. There are states that have apparently preferred to leave considerable amount of money, indeed most of the money, the federal government would pay for most of it, on the table, which is to leave the health care of their own residents on the table. Governor Martinez, you did not make that decision. An article was provided me from the Albuquerque Journal where you stated access to health care has the potential to improve the well-being of our families, so our kids can learn better in school, and so mom and dad can be better parents and more productive employees. You did accept Medicaid expansion.
I did.
And I wish you discussed the remarkable results there. The figures I have show that your uninsured rate was 25%, and that it's down now to 10.2%. Are those figures correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Governor Herbert, so you found that rather than assuming the federal government was an adversary, working with the federal government, particularly when there was money on the table and the health and lives of your own residents was at stake, that is not always an adversarial relationship, but can be a very beneficial relationship, perhaps the way the founders saw it. Governor Herbert, you, of course, tried to expand Medicaid in Utah, and I commend you for the several compromises that you tried to achieve so that Medicaid could be, or so that health care could be available for more in Utah. And you were not able to do that. You said the poorest among us will continue to struggle until Utah leaders can find agreement on this difficult issue. What was difficult with the federal government funding the lion's share of health care and your compromising approach so as to try to bring together people who might otherwise be adversaries?
Well, one, I respectfully reject the attitude that it ought to be adversarial. I think it ought to be collaborative. We have difference of opinion. There may be some tension there, but it shouldn't be adversarial. We should try to solve the people's problems.
Precisely.
All the money that the federal government gets comes from state taxpayers. You take the money from us, you come back, you come up with programs. Sometimes we like them, sometimes we don't. We learn from the states. We learn from Susana Martinez in New Mexico and how it works there, and we'll learn, and maybe that we'll want to adopt in Utah.
Why were you unable, since you were willing to compromise, to get Medicaid expansion?
Because we could not convince members of the legislature, particularly in our House side, that it would be the fiscally responsible thing to do in the long term. It's not just a matter of what can we get today, get some of our taxpayers' money back, but what's going to be the ongoing obligation in the long term? Can we afford to buy today and not afford to buy tomorrow?
Yeah, that was the reason that was given, even though there was a huge amount of money on the table and no indication that Congress was going to pull it back. Governor Otter, did you mention that you had tried some sort of compromise in this regard as well?
I have, and I continue to. In fact, I have one before the legislature this year.
I just want to say that what this does indicate is that the governors are closest to the people, and while we see some states that would rather leave that health care leave where, for example, Governor Martinez was unwilling to leave the health care of her residents. Increasingly, we do see more states, even though the affordable health care has been under such assault in Congress, we now see more states wanting to be a part of the program. And I think that has everything to do with who is closest to the people. We can debate the matter here. You've got to live with the matter in the states. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Blum, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists today for being here. I must say, first of all, I'm a huge supporter of the 10th Amendment. In addition to it being in the Constitution, I also know that governors and their state legislators can do most everything less expensive than this federal government and produce better results. You see, here in Washington, this is not news to you all, there is no penalty for failure. Typically, when a program here doesn't produce results, we just spend more money on it. It's always we haven't spent enough money. But you all are CEOs of your states, and you have to live with the results. So thank you for being here, and thank you for what you do. I don't have an agenda here, but I would like to chat about sanctuary cities, sanctuary counties. I'm from eastern Iowa, and when I'm out there talking to people, they just don't understand how cities, counties, it's not states per se, but how can they can choose to ignore the law. And we've had presidents who, if they didn't like a law, let's just not enforce it. You know, I think you would all agree one of the reasons we're the greatest nation on the face of this earth is because of the rule of law, and we're a nation of laws. So I would, and I'm going to listen. I'd like to have your opinions about sanctuary cities, how you deal with that in your state. I don't know if you have any in your states, but what your thoughts on that are.
Well, us going first, it's a challenge because we do respect our local governments in Utah, so our cities, our mayors and council people, our county commissioners. We don't support anything other than the rule of law. We think if anybody goes contrary to that, that's a mistake. If you don't like the law, change the law, whether it's a federal law or a state law. So I think we're asking for chaos and division in our country if we don't adhere to the rule of law.
Do you have sanctuary cities in Utah?
Maybe Salt Lake City, I think the mayor there would indicate we're not going to round up people and to violate their peace and tranquility to be upholding the law of the federal government, so I don't feel like it's their responsibility. So I don't know if I'd say we're a sanctuary city there, but that would probably be the only place that would be considered at all. I don't think they claim to be a sanctuary city.
Recently I saw on TV, you probably all did as well, the Oakland, California mayor saying that she felt it was her, ethically, she needed to forewarn potentially illegal immigrants that ICE was going to conduct operations in their area or in their neighborhood. Governor, can you give me your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts really are, it's a federal issue. We actually tried to find a state solution. We went to the, were challenged in the court by the Obama administration. We lost, where the court said this is a federal issue. I later met with President Obama, and he talked about his executive order, and I said, well, you're trying to do the same thing I did. We tried to do it by law and a state right position. You're trying to do it by executive order, and you're going to lose in court too, because it's a congressional responsibility. It's disappointing, I think, to many people across the country that we can't come together on that. Maybe there's different aspects we have disagreement, but we all agree we should secure the borders. Why don't we just do that? It's not just the gate, or excuse me, not just the fence and the wall. Again, talking to President Obama about this, the gate doesn't work. We ought to work on the gate so that people come and go as we think it would be appropriate. And he agrees. He says, why can't we get Congress to act? That was President Obama to me. Well, that's the frustration, I think, of many people across the country.
Well said. Governor Martinez?
Yes. As governor, I took an oath to enforce the rule of law, that whether that be the federal government and the implementation of their federal laws and the state laws. However, I also understand that the enforcement of immigration laws is that of the federal government and not of the state. I do not support sanctuary cities. I think it is something that is can be very chaotic. We are releasing individuals from jails, et cetera, that are violent offenders and not notifying the federal government that someone is within our community who is a violent offender, whether released from prison or from the state or from local jails, that now are amongst the population of the people. And I have a responsibility to protect the people of the state of New Mexico, the citizens of New Mexico, from anyone who is violent and being released from a jail. So I signed an executive order just shortly after becoming governor and doing away with sanctuary state policies. That doesn't mean cities have not declared themselves as a sanctuary city. However, I am very much not in favor of that. If the law needs to be changed, the federal law, then change it. But the confusion that is taking place is going to end up in some very terrible outcomes. And so that is why I don't support it. I support making sure that we're enforcing the rule of law.
With the indulgence of the chair, could Governor Otter answer my question? Governor Otter.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. You know, it really is a pretty simple, 28 words. Those powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor denied to the states by it are reserved to the states respectfully or to the people. And if you want to view the scope and the jurisdiction of supremacy, look to Article 1, Section 8, or Section 8 of Article 1, because those enumerated powers are exactly what the 10th Amendment was talking about. That is where the government, federal government, is supposed to exercise supremacy. Those are the limited and delegated powers.
Thank you. I've gone past my time, but thank you for your service to your states. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, if you'd just allow me real quickly, picking up, I think, on a distinction made by Governor Herbert, there is a distinction between declaring oneself a sanctuary city or county and a local police force or sheriff's office saying it's a federal responsibility for enforcement, not ours, and we're not going to take that on ourselves. Those are two different things, and I think I heard Governor Herbert make that distinction. Certainly in my community, that is our position. We don't declare it sanctuary, but we don't feel that it's our responsibility locally to enforce federal immigration laws as such. That's a federal responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all the governors for your service and for your testimony today. I would like to ask you about President Trump's infrastructure proposal and how it is going to affect your states. When the President released his proposed budget for 2019, he announced the vague outlines of a plan that he claims will boost investment in infrastructure in our nation. We need it. His plan includes $40 billion through a rural block grant program, as well as $130 billion in various funding pots for which states will compete. But even if they win this competition, states would receive only 20% of the amount needed to fund an infrastructure project, and states and localities would have to contribute the remaining 80% of the cost. He further went forward with his idea to allow states to impose tolls on all interstate highways. And he says this would allow them to raise the revenue for the infrastructure investment. So I'd like to ask all of you, would you raise tolls on interstate highways to generate revenues for the infrastructure funding under this plan for your state? Are you planning to raise tolls? Which, if you want to go down, just starting with Governor Herbert and Martinez, Otter.
There may be some appropriate use of toll roads. We see them around the country. Certainly the Pennsylvania Turnpike and others have been worked out very successfully. I'm not really in favor of toll roads. I think that we need to address our infrastructure needs. It's been neglected. I think President Trump was right about that since the Eisenhower days. But probably an adjustment of the gasoline tax, which has not been done for, what, 25 years or so.
I agree.
So if you're going to do that, just to recapture what we've lost to inflation, it would probably be a good thing. That being said, you know, states aren't waiting for the federal government. Again, we appreciate the partnership when it's appropriate. You're taking money from us, and we'd like to get some of it back. We just completed one of the larger construction projects in America, $1.7 billion of our interstate, did it all with state dollars.
Governor Martinez, would you support a gas tax for infrastructure?
No, ma'am, I would not.
Okay.
We have actually done something very different in New Mexico. Having had continuing resolutions for the budget, we had to become very creative in how we were going to widen roads, make roads more accessible. We do not have any toll booths in New Mexico. And so what we've done is made sure that there was skin in the game for local communities, counties, the legislators that represent those counties and municipalities in the state legislature, that their port dollars are going towards true infrastructure. The state would, and then the part of the infrastructure dollars that were given to me were a part of that, and then federal dollars were. Also private sector. They were laying, for example, Facebook, when we brought them in, they were going to lay down cable for the internet, and what we did through the Department of Transportation is actually dig the trenches for them to be able to then lay down the cable that was necessary for the web. And so these are public-private, community, local projects for very big projects of road infrastructure that were not only funded, but completed, and completed on time and on budget.
And Governor Otter, would you support a gas tax, or would you support tolls on your interstate highways?
As recently as 2 years ago, I increased the gas tax in Idaho, and also the licensure of automobiles. One of the problems with just looking at the gas tax is that we have so many automobiles that are either getting 50 miles to the gallon, but still want the same amount of safety, still want the same amount of space on the highway, but are getting 50 miles to the gallon or are run off of electricity. In Idaho, in fact, a lot of places in the West, it would be very difficult to put in toll roads because of the access to the freeway, to the state freeways. So that's something we might be able to find some isolated places where we could do that. But I can tell you this, the infrastructure in all the West, and especially Idaho, because we are a value-added manufacturing state, and there's only one way to get our products to market, and that's down that highway.
Okay, and also his budget would cut $122 billion from the existing Highway Trust Fund over 10 years. And this means states would receive less money from federal highway and transit formula programs, which currently match at a rate of 80% federal to 20% local. So let me ask all of you, would your states like to receive less money from the Highway Trust Fund?
You know, we would take less money. If you'll take away the red tape, the redundancy, I've met with our contractors in Utah, 7 major road builders, and say, if we could get the money block granted to the states without all the federal red tape, we'll build the same number of roads for 15% less money. You don't have to have more money. You just cut and save.
Well, my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record statements from the National Association of Counties on this subject and from the New Deal Coalition, Debbie Cox Bolton, her executive.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank the Chair.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Bishop?
I have one request, if I could, from the task force at the end of this. All of you have spoken very well about how if everyone has good intentions, we can always get along. The problem that Congress has to try and come up with rules to make sure that if people are jerks, we can still get along. So what the task force needs from you three, if you would be kind enough, are some specific recommendations of what we can do, not just to ensure that you are consulted, but you are remembered for it, what we can talk about. I didn't get a chance to ask you about the mission creep, how we can deal with those issues of mission creep. Should states have not just standing, which they have, but special standing in order to sue on issues that are imposed upon you? Some specific ideas that can be very helpful to ensure that regardless of what happens, states are recognized, states are understood, and states have the right to have that statement. So I'm asking that for the task force, not for the subcommittee purposes, but for the purpose of the task force as we try and come up with recommendations. So anything you give me that is specific as what we can do statutorily to help on all these issues, like as the gentlelady from the district said, you know, what do you do if the money is laying on the table?
Representative Bishop, I can tell you this. Consult us at the beginning. Generally, what we find is we're invited late to the party. Public policy has already started to see its first or second or third draft by the time, if they ever do ask the states, by the time the states are asked. And make it a requirement for the agencies that are going to put in new rules, which become laws and which become those laws that we have to operate by. But ask us at the beginning, is this something you folks need? Are we solving a problem here, or are we looking for just to create another law?
Perfect. Help me find a place that we can statutorily mandate that.
Can I add, Congressman Bishop, that it would be nice if the Congress would say, when issues come before them, and say, is this best handled at the state level? That'll be the first question. Maybe it's their responsibility. Maybe they can address this better rather than just taking on anything and everything. I think, again, we the people of America are asking you to do more than was ever envisioned by our Constitution or Founding Fathers. And the states are adept, as Congressman Pelosi said yesterday, laboratories of democracy. You guys should be leading out on policy. We have a lot of responsibility. You have a few. Article 1, Section 8, as Governor Otter mentioned. So ask yourself, is this really something we should do, or should we let this be handled by the states?
I just have one last statement, if I may. I am certainly hopeful that federalism is not just a principle or a theory, but that it is actually a practice as a United States citizen. And with that, I think we will actually become a better country every single day, understanding that the states have the solutions for their people that may be very different from our neighbors, allowing us to take lead in many of the projects and many of the things in which the federal government cannot make a single solution that satisfies us all.
Would my friend from Utah yield for a minute?
I don't know. Would I? It depends. What are you going to say?
I would certainly support his request, but I would remind ourselves respectfully. We have 3 governors from Western states in front of us. We don't have the Northeast perspective. We don't have the West Coast perspective. And this is a big country. And there could be other points of view. And I just hope that in inviting feedback to inform us in considering a statute, that we make sure we have broad feedback from other experiences, including, well, other states, just so that we're well informed and that we're getting all balanced points of view, with no disrespect at all, because I found the testimony quite convincing this morning in many respects. But I just asked that of my friend from Utah.
Can I just respond? Because I'm the one here who's been the chairman here 3 years ago of the National Governors Association, a bipartisan organization. We get along actually very well. Very congenial, and we respect each other's different opinions on things. So I would welcome all 50 states and the 5 territories, for that matter, to weigh in on this issue. But I can tell you, having experienced my involvement for 8 years with the National Governors Association, most all of us would say, give us more flexibility. Let us take on the challenges. We don't need the one-size-fits-all mentality that comes too often out of Washington, D.C. Democrats and Republicans alike would agree with that. So I think get everybody. I think you'll find that we have a lot of consensus on this issue amongst the states.
I had dinner last night with your colleague, John Carney of Delaware, and he said very nice things about you.
Well, and I'll say nice things about him. We were lieutenant governors together, so we've been around for a long time.
Just for the record, we gave every opportunity for a Democrat governor to join the panel and would really like to have heard from them. In that regard, what I would recommend is that if there are other governors, Republican or Democrat, who would like to submit a statement for the record will be held open for 2 weeks. I'll remind you of that at the conclusion of the hearing. At this time, I'll recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Desaulniers, for his questions. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And being from California, I wish our governor was here. It would be even more entertaining. He always is. Let me just say, this challenge, of course, has been with this country forever, how this relationship works. When I was on the executive board of the National Conference of State Legislatures, to your comments, Governor. I found that environment to be very collegial, bipartisan, being a Democrat from the Bay Area and the state Senate. So there are examples where this works, and I think when you're involved in that, as you are, you realize that 50 states are very different, and there's lots of communities within that. But there are compelling places, and I want to talk specifically about addiction and opioid addiction in my questions. And the results of the bipartisan commission that the administration put together that was chaired by former Governor Christie, and what the relationship is in terms of best practices to this epidemic and the federal government's role. So one of the key quotes from that report from Governor Christie is one of the most important recommendations in the final report is getting federal funding support more quickly and effectively to state governments who are in the front lines of fighting this addiction battle every day. In my district, very different from other places. It's a more upscale part of the Bay Area, or much of my district, and it's upper middle income. I had lots of meetings and put a good deal of my time in my former job working with the Attorney General's office, now U.S. Senator Kamala Harris, to deal with that. So knowing that it's very different in different communities, what do you need from the federal government, and could you express the urgency you need when it comes to addiction and opioid addiction in your states?
We're not asking for much from the federal government. Again, I am cognizant of your budget challenges. The fact that you're $21 trillion in debt is not lost on a state that has a AAA bond rating. We try to live within our means and not spend more than we take in. We have rational debt. So that being said, I'm not looking to the federal government. We're trying to do this. This has been an issue that's been raised by the National Governors Association 4 years ago. We're on the cutting edge of this in the states. We're doing things in our respective states to address this issue. We're putting warning labels. There's talk about litigation lawsuits against the pharmaceuticals that have evidently withheld information about the addictive nature of these drugs. That's probably something that's going to be in our future. Think tobacco litigation. We are training our doctors better. We have now put a database in the state of Utah so the doctors can know if you're doctor shopping and what your issues have been. If you've been in the emergency room, if you've been to a doctor and your general practitioner, they can all access this on the internet without violation of HIPAA laws. We've got that wired in, so there's permission given. So again, we're doing things at the states. We're learning from each other, and again, we'll homogenize together as we find the successes that are taking place in the states. So I'm not asking for anything from the federal government.
Either of you?
No. Actually, we've done the very same thing in making sure that we can prevent that kind of doctor shopping. You know, you go in for a root canal and you get 30 days worth of opioids, which is really completely unnecessary. However, that person can become addicted, and therefore the database is very helpful for us to make sure that there isn't that doctor shopping, because from the opioids and we're not able to continue to have access, then you turn over to heroin. And heroin is very accessible because we're on the border, may be very different from Montana, maybe very different from the middle of the country, but right there in New Mexico, it is very accessible and very cheap.
During our meetings this week, we had a very good roundtable on, and we had a report from the task force to which you referred that Governor Christie held. And there was one thing that almost all the states needed, and that was a review of all federal rules and regulations that inhibit us from defending ourselves from that epidemic.
And one thing I would ask for your help with, Representative Carter, Republican from Georgia, a pharmacist, he and I have worked closely together in California. We spent $5 million, which is not significant in our budget, to make sure that the Department of Justice and the medical board has real-time information for people who are doctor shopping. So one of the things that Representative Carter and I have been working on is interoperability, as all states tried to bring this system up. And then just lastly, until I came to Congress, I never was a states' right advocate, but being from California, I'm becoming more and more of one. When you see things that work well in one state that's very different from another state, if we could have more of a conversation that I would see as more bipartisan, more evidence-based, that what works in the Bay Area is not going to work in many of your jurisdictions and vice versa. Some of that is politically driven, obviously, but when we really look at the evidence and what works, including on immigration, I wish we had more of those discussions, and I hope you have them when you meet with your colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's just an honor. We had 3 governors at one shot. The committee has heard from state and local governments, and I certainly hear from them at home all the time, that the compliance of federal regulations is very, very expensive. And lawmakers have shared compliance with federal, some lawmakers have shared compliance with federal regulators, forcing local governments to create funding by increasing sales and property taxes on citizens. Do you know how much money, say, your states spend to comply with federal mandates and regulations? You know,
as I mentioned earlier, and we could probably reduce it to a number, but it's our local governments tell us, we'll give you $1 of federal government dollar to spend in exchange for 85 cents. So it's about a 15% margin as a minimum.
Okay, I'll give you another question. I used to be a state legislator in Wisconsin, and one of the things that bothered me is sometimes federal funds come with a maintenance of effort requirement in which you're really forced to spend money just to keep the federal funds coming, money that you don't want to spend. Have you guys had any experience like that?
We have. Remember years ago the COPS grant, where you're trying to get public safety, and so you would get money from the federal government to hire policemen, but then you had to maintain those. You could not diminish your law enforcement, so it was built into your baseline. You took the grant, and then you had to continue to spend money. Again, it's part of the concern we talked about with Medicaid expansion. For our legislators, the concern is what is going to be the ongoing cost? And the match just stays the same, so you're still going to have to come up with your portion of the match, and that's an ongoing maintenance thing. And with the rising costs of health care, it's caused some of the legislators say, we can afford it today, but we don't think we can afford our match tomorrow.
How about TANF? You guys do you guys have any problem spending all your TANF dollars, or when things are going well, do you find that you have to look around to spend things on that you really wouldn't spend them on otherwise?
You know, we've taken a little different approach in Utah. Again, we appreciate the programs that are out there to help people get out of poverty. We're probably the state leading the nation in getting people out of poverty. The average length of time when people come to us and say on Medicaid is only 9 months, because we emphasize we're going to help you in the short term, but we're going to give you education, training, and skills so you can start helping yourself. It's the old adage of we're not just going to give you a fish, we're going to teach you to fish. And that's something that I think is a good program that we're doing in Utah that I think other states that work efforts.
It is, but I'm going to tell you the problem that I think we bumped into in Wisconsin. And that is when you're successful, you have to keep spending the same amount of money or more, right? Which is a problem. You're kind of penalized for being successful because the federal government says if you want to keep this money coming, find something to spend it on. And in that way, you kind of penalize the successful states.
Well, that's an adverse incentive, and so that's probably not a good policy.
Okay, but you guys never have a problem spending all your TANF money. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. For example, CHIP. We don't spend all the CHIP money. Again, we're working on trying to get people off government assistance. Most people don't want to have government assistance. They want to have a job. They want to be able to be self-sustaining. That's the American way. So we don't spend it just to spend it and find ways to spend it. We're trying to actually solve problems.
You can always find a way, though, to spend it that might be good. I mean, the question is, I should put it this way. Because of maintenance effort, are you spending dollars that you feel you would never spend on your own if you had to tax yourself for it? I guess I should put it that way.
I think there's many areas, Congressman, where we could cut down on the amount of federal dollars that we need if we're allowed to implement those things that the federal government or those programs want us to achieve. And I think Governor Herbert has spoke to it very well, and that is we know that there's going to be a time when people are going to hit an economic or a financial speed bump in their life. And yes, it's important that they have a government which can respond to that, but only on a temporary basis. And if we had the rules and regulations that we could enforce that say, okay, while you're laid up, while you're doing this, you're going to get an education. We're going to send you back to school, and we would spend some of that money then on getting you retrofitted for the economy of the state of Idaho in a new profession. If we were allowed to.
I'll give you one final question here in the final 30 seconds. Obviously, everybody's thinking about what went on in Florida, and you get so much stuff on the internet and so many articles on there, you don't know what's true and what's not true. But it appears as though there have been federal grants in which you are encouraged to report less crimes or less arrests or that sort of thing. So in other words, maybe people do things different to pretend that they have better outcomes than they're having. In other words, they're in this case apparently arresting less people than they should arrest, or I would say they should arrest to get more federal money. Do you find that there are any other programs like that in which you are incentivized to hit targets that you might not want to hit?
You know, I can't think of anything. If in fact that's the case, again, we can see the incentive is in the wrong place. It ought to be the incentive ought to be to have better outcomes, and we ought to be full and transparent in how we collect the data and not try to game the system.
I see at times there are federal dollars, for example, in law enforcement and the maintenance of efforts that takes place. However, the paperwork, the amount of documentation that is required to be submitted, the limitations that come with those dollars, when they may be better used different than having to come to the federal government for permission to change the shift a little bit, but still under the umbrella of law enforcement, that becomes a challenge for us.
If I understand your question, Congressman, probably the most egregious that I've seen is the introduction of a new species under the Endangered Species Act that then the state is required to maintain.
Okay, I'd like to thank the chair for giving me an additional minute.
So would I.
At this time, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. And the first thing I want to do is, Governor Martinez, is your testimony, you talked about the fact that there are more than 800 applications for permits to drill in Mexico at a cost of approximately $1.9 million to New Mexico and $3.4 million to the federal government per day. And I think you want to say that that it takes an average of 250 days. That's $850 million, just on the federal side. And the reason I bring that up is that I've been here, what's today, the 27th? I've been here 3 years, 1 month, and 21 days. And one of the first things I pushed was opening up federal lands for energy. We are an energy superpower. There's no question about it. Federal government has tremendous resources, and I bring this up in the context of infrastructure because I think a gas tax is the revenue source of diminishing returns. Governor Otter made this point about the fuel efficiency that we're achieving, and we continue to want to do that. Everybody wants more fuel-efficient vehicles. So when you attach a gas tax, you know that that is a revenue source of diminishing return. What I think might be more helpful is if we take your testimony and this whole permitting thing, expedite this, get it down so that we not only can shorten the amount of time it takes to take advantage of a lease, but increase the royalties. We haven't increased the royalties on federal energy resources since the 1920s, and direct a portion of that into the Highway Trust Fund for infrastructure. We could set it up on a system where there could be matching money for the states and let the states manage it. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thank you very much for that question and the comment. I think it's very important to understand that New Mexico is really a gem within the country, not only for energy independence for the country, but also the revenues that it generates. For petroleum, there are so many products. It's not just for vehicles.
That's
and
right.
Gas is not just for vehicles. I mean, what products use the petroleum? And if we took that out of every product that we see and touch every day, we would be shocked to know how much of that is used in a variety of products. Under the previous administration, it was better to say nothing to the private industry, not to give permission or to deny it. Under my previous administration as a governor, the same thing. It was easier to say nothing, which cost people money to have something sitting there. We had some of these permits sitting there 3 years when I entered into office. So there was a quick move of going forward and backwards for every permit coming in the door and everything that was sitting there. To be able to have the revenues that allow us for education, allow for special projects, infrastructure projects that we have, and our permanent fund. We have a permanent fund that's one of the healthiest ones in the country because of oil and gas. Just in case, when it was developed, we ran out of oil and gas. But because technology is so great now, we're able to actually produce more and make it more available so that we're not relying on countries that are in such turmoil.
Well, it's been reported that there's a formation out west in western Colorado, southwestern Wyoming, and northern Utah, the Green River Formation, that holds 3 trillion barrels of recoverable oil. That's 3 times what the entire world's used in the last 100 years. I don't want to stay focused on that. I want to talk about some of these other issues and a more collaborative effort between state and local government. I think that's a legitimate discussion, particularly since my brother's a county engineer, and on how we can work on infrastructure together on the permitting. What we've seen over the last few years is just an enormous drag on infrastructure and really on the economy because of permitting. The infrastructure is so important to the economy. I'd like to get some feedback from each of you on how you see we could improve that process, maybe let the state and local governments do more of the work in a collaborative way, as you talk about, Governor Herbert.
Well, thank you. Again, I come from local government. I was a county commissioner for 14 years. I participated with NACO on many things. We railed against the federal government when I was there about the unfunded or underfunded mandates would come to local government. So the issue still is here. It's always probably going to be here, but at least we ought to be cognizant of it. In Utah, we in fact they have an association for the cities called the League of Cities and Towns. They come. We have 245 of them that they represent, the cities of the state, 29 counties, part of our Utah Association of Counties. They are probably the most active people on the Hill during the legislative session to make sure that what we do, they get input, they're invited. We equalize our educational funding in the state of Utah so that if you're in a rural part on the Navajo Nation, that you get as much education funding as you do if you're in the middle of the urban heartland of the state of Utah. So we try to respect, all the local government and their subdivisions and make sure that they're part of the decision-making process in the state of Utah. Again, a lot of it's just an attitude. We're saying we're not going to make decisions at the state level until we've got input from the local levels. And some of that we devolve down and let them say, you know what, that's a county issue. In your county, you take care of it. That's a city issue. Your city, you take care of it. And the state will stay out of it.
Okay, in that regard, and this is my last question, we've talked a good bit about strengthening state and local consultation requirements of reforming the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act and to help restore the state's partnership with the federal government. What I want to know is how important are these types of reforms, and are there other possible areas for reform that Congress should be looking at to improve the relationship or communication between the federal government and the states? And each of you can answer that, and we'll be done.
Mr. Chairman, let me begin by saying we learned a lot about ourselves during the recession between 08 and 10. And what we did is what almost every Idaho family did, is they sat around the breakfast table when the work ran out for Dad and said, what things do what is necessary and what is nice? To find out what is necessary, we looked to the Constitution. And the Constitution was pretty specific about an education system for the state of Idaho and other areas. And then we said, well, what is nice? If we haven't got the money for nice, we're not going to do those things anymore. And so I think at every level of government, especially when you run into a time like the Great Recession, like the recession was, that's the process that you have to go through. And even further than that, after the recession, we didn't go back to the old ways of doing things because we learned there were a lot of things that were simply not the proper role of government.
Thank you, Governor Martinez.
I completely support that. Having inherited the largest structural deficit in the history of our state, I have not raised a tax once. And they can call it whatever they want, revenue enhancements, whatever it may be. We've not raised a single tax, but we actually become competitive with our surrounding states, which didn't exist for a very, very long time. It was believed doing the same thing over and over again, where we're going to get different results, and we didn't. We became competitive, and we've actually recruited companies and businesses to New Mexico because we're doing it different. However, now we're turning over an amazing budget. We have a surplus, we have great royalties, we have a permanent fund that's outstanding. But I hope that the next governor doesn't see it as a way to start a spending frenzy and in growing government back to where it used to be, which was absolutely unnecessary. Way too many employees to actually complete the mission of the state. And so that's what we've done, is reduce our actual government size to fit what was necessary for us to deliver the services that are required.
Thank you. Governor Herbert?
I'll just finish by saying this. You've heard me say this already, but all 435 members of the House, all 100 members of the Senate, the President should always ask the question, is this an issue, something that should be better addressed at the state level? That should be the beginning of every discussion. And there'll be differences of opinion, but many times you're going to say, you know what, that probably is going to be better and more effectively addressed at the state level. Let them take on that responsibility. We would welcome that. And I think that's a bipartisan approach, by the way, of that feeling. Thanks for hearing us today.
Well, I thank our witnesses again for appearing before us today. I think this has been an excellent hearing and very constructive. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. If there's no further business without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Good job, kiddo. Thank you. Thank you. Glad you're better. Oh, I hope you get better. Back surgery. I hope you got someone good. All right. Hey, Rob, thank you.